Hello everyone and welcome to my guide on Enigma's Cold War server, where today we are specifically looking at how to do CAS operations as combat air support or close air support. And I'll be breaking this down into individual sections. I'll put the timestamps in the description, so feel free to jump ahead to whichever section you like. So to begin with, we're going to be looking at defining what we mean by CAS and how this helps us push the front line, win the campaign. Then I'm going to be looking briefly at what kind of airframes are suitable for this role. And then we're going to look at, well, how do you find targets? And then before finishing, we're going to look a bit briefly about how you actually go about engaging the targets. Does vary very much from airframe to airframe, so I'll be trying to give some general tips that work with most airframes, but I won't be able to cover everything. If you do have questions about a particular airframe, do leave them down below. I'll try and either answer there or go through it in a separate video. Okay, so first of all then, what do I mean when I say CAS in regards to Enigma's Cold War? Here what we're really talking about is destroying the frontline enemy units in order to cause attrition and push the front. This is not talking about doing other types of ground strikes, those on depots and further back industrial targets. I will be covering those, but I'll cover those in their own strike video. For now I'm just talking about frontline targets. Now, as for how this helps you actually go about pushing sectors, at the end of each tick, what the server does is analyse how many units are on across each front line, that is, each sector facing across from an enemy sector hexagon. Whichever side has the most units on their side will do damage to the enemy sector's supply. Then on top of that, they have to use supply in order to replenish any losses in order to reinforce the front line. What this means effectively is the more ground units you destroy, the more damage the enemy sector is going to take, and so the sooner you will be able to get a complete capture of that enemy sector. This is by far the most effective way to actually push sectors and capture them, and so ground attack is really important on Enigma's Cold War. So then, with that out of the way, what kind of aircraft are good for this role? Well, the obvious two are the A-10A and the Frogfoot, the Su-25. These are both really good, can carry a huge amount of ordnance, are both more or less capable of defending themselves in the right hands, and both can take a fair amount of punishment, so don't have to worry too much about the ground targets. Other obvious choice is helicopters. Helicopters can do massive amounts of damage. Now, I'm not going to be focusing too much on helicopters today because helicopters have a lot of their own unique mechanics that can really help with their ground attack game, and so I'm going to be covering those in a separate video. And recently we've had the A4 unveiled, and that is also very capable as a ground attack CAS aircraft. But it's also worth noting that we shouldn't discount really any of the other airframes. Even those that are much more suited towards fighter playstyles. Pretty much every airframe in the server can be armed with ground attack ordnance, and so can do ground attack in a pinch. They're probably not going to be able to do it as well as the more dedicated craft, either lacking ordnance or lacking the ability to hit targets precisely, but they do have advantages such as generally better speed and certainly better capacity to do air-to-air combat if they do need to. So definitely if you find yourself in a situation where you've got complete air supremacy, even if your only module is say an F5, by all means load up the F5 with rockets, do a CAS strike. That is really going to help your team a lot more than you flying around a completely uncontested airspace. Now on to the real heart of the matter, and the reason most of you are probably watching this video is how do you actually go about finding the ground targets? I did a video on this previously, but that was in the 1.0 version. Some of that still applies, but a lot of it is outdated now. Now, when it comes to finding ground targets, I really want to break this down into two categories. The first, the easiest way, is if someone has done scouting for you ahead of time. Scouting is incredibly powerful on Enigma's Cold War server. It can be done by both fixed-wing aircraft and helicopter dropped crews, and it highlights on the map for your entire team where all nearby ground targets are. So to check this, you just need to go to F10. If you see a whole load of orange circles on the map, those are marked ground targets. You can even click on them to get information on what particular targets are in that position, might help you pick loadouts. And so then it's just simply a matter of taking off and heading towards these circles, and you will find the ground target right where they're marked. One little note is the centre of each sector's hexagon does have its own little orange circle. That is not a marked ground target, that is simply there for you to be able to click on to get the name of the sector if you're communicating with friends. The nice thing about the scouted targets is they will automatically remove themselves from the map when they are destroyed, so you don't have to worry about heading in on targets that are already gone. Equally, this can be really handy for confirming you have cleared out a site. One slight word of caution though is many vehicles will cook off in this game instead of immediately destroying themselves, and so if you see flame coming out of a target, it is destroyed. But it will normally remain on the map, normally remain as not your kill until the target actually explodes about a minute later. Then you'll see the kill coming in the kill feed and the marker will disappear off the map. So don't worry, if you do see fire on the target, that does mean it's dead. You can stop your attack, even if it's still showing up on the map. Now, of course, a lot of the time you're not going to be lucky enough to have a target scouted for you. This is very often the case at the start of a new server reset where nothing has been scouted, and when you've got friendlies that have already taken out the targets, you're going to have to do the hard work and go looking yourself. Now, the big bit of advice here is to be looking in the right place. On the 2.0 version of Enigma's Cold War, targets only spawn along the front line that are directly adjacent to an enemy hexagon. So you only have to look through a very, very narrow area. You don't need to go deep inside the enemy sector, just scout along the front line itself, just on the enemy side. As for spotting the targets, I've got two general tips there. One is if your aircraft is equipped with an RWR receiver, you can keep an eye out for the enemy AAA radar stations locking onto you. The exact markings you'll get depend on the aircraft, but it will be whatever is the equivalent of a Shilka if you're fighting against Red 4, or a Vulcan if you're fighting against Blue 4. What you can then do is use that radar beam to home you in towards the target, but do of course be careful. If you are getting pinged by a Shilka or a Vulcan, it does mean it's looking at you and it will absolutely try and kill you. Otherwise, we fall back to our good old-fashioned Mark 1 eyeball, zoom in and have a careful look along the ground. Now, exactly what the ground targets look like does constantly change as the developers are constantly updating the game, but at the time of recording, which is at the tail end of May 2023, the vast majority of ground targets are marked with a white barracks building, which does return small ground arms fire, and this will be surrounded by a number of different vehicles scattered around it in a circle. So really what I do is search the ground, looking out for those white buildings more than anything else, although it is also worth keeping an eye out for the dark patches of several clustered vehicles together. You'll generally find these placed along openings, so keep an eye out for areas just either side of towns, or in clearings within forests is very often where you will encounter these. And finally, not the best way of searching for these, but something to be aware of, is when they do shoot at you, you will get big tracer fire coming up from the ground. That very, very clearly indicates where the enemy are, but of course you ideally want to be seeing them before you get within range for them to be firing at you. And finally, a big bit of advice for spotting these ground targets is, if you can, take a wingman. Wingmen really, really do help here. 2 sets of eyes is much, much better than just 1 set of eyes. You can scan a much larger area of ground, you are much better at picking up things the other person has missed, and notably it's a lot easier to see tracer fire going in on your wingman than it is to see tracer fire going in on you. Otherwise, really this is a matter of practice and so try and get out there, keep an eye on the ground targets. Once you get used to what you're looking for, it becomes much easier to start spotting these. So now you've managed to spot the target, how do you actually go about, blowing the thing up? Now this really does vary from airframe to airframe, and even with a given airframe you can get dozens of different pieces of advice, so I'm going to try and keep this general as possible and just break it down into two general strategies that work well for me depending on what I'm using. The first tactic, and by far my favourite, and the one that is very suited towards use with things like the Hind and the A-10, is initial precision strikes followed up by imprecise wiping of the base. For this you do need some kind of long-range standoff and notably very accurate weapon, such as the anti-tank missiles on the Hind or the Maverick in the A-10 or the Viggen. With these you want to pick off the high priority threats before they get within range of you. This is the radar AAA is your number one priority here. These almost always spawn next to any base. Sometimes you will get multiple on a single base, and these are by far the most dangerous. Even something like an A-10 will be taken out in a single burst if a Shilka gets a good shot off. Once the Shilka is down, or the Vulcan if you are attacking a Blue 4 base, then do bear in mind there are other types of AAA that can fire, notably the Bofors, and I've also seen 100mm flat cannons. Although these tend to be a lot less accurate and slower firing than the radar-guided alternatives, when they do hit, that is a game over for you. So very much do think about taking those out before you get too close. And it is worth bearing in mind that even things like tanks and APCs can return fire, whether that is with their 50 cal turrets or even their main gun. Again, the main gun is very unlikely to hit you, but if you are very slow and on an easily predictable path, such as an A-10 making a guns run or a helicopter hovering nearby, you can absolutely take a main tank gun, and again there is no aircraft in the game that will withstand that. Once you have taken out the major threats, it's then a case of going in with less precise munitions. Things like rockets, cluster bombs, or your cannons on your various aircraft can do a huge amount of damage and are excellent for clearing up the last targets, such as any trucks, any poorly defended APCs, or the actual barracks itself. The alternative approach to this, however, is to do a long-range standoff saturation strike. The Frogfoot is particularly well suited with this. Here you're not really aiming for any individual targets, you're looking to put as many rounds into the general area of the enemy outpost as possible in order to wipe it out, and then you can get clear to freedom without really taking any significant damage yourself. The best way of employing this really is with rockets. Multiple planes have multiple rocket launchers that can incredibly saturate a given area with a huge amount of fire, very often from a fair distance away, and then the plane can simply RTB, having done a lot of damage in the area. Very often you won't completely clear a base here, but again, you don't need to completely clear the base, you need to do damage, you need to destroy ground vehicles. So even if you only get 70% of the targets, that is still a lot of enemy destroyed that can really shift the balance of the fight. And a little final note to bear in mind, whatever tactic you're employing on actually engaging the ground targets, do try to protect your airframe. Now I know myself it is very tempting to go in, try and get one more kill even with a risky pass. It's really not worth it as far as your team is concerned. Your airframe being shot down again costs your side attrition points. That is just undoing all of the work that you've been doing there. This is particularly noteworthy if you're flying the A-10, which right now is one of the most expensive airframes to bring out, and so losing an A-10 is actually a pretty big deal for your side. It is really not worth going in to get one extra tank kill if you're going to lose the plane. So err on the side of caution, disengage when you're out of your long-range missiles, don't go in for that risky pass. It generally is not going to be worth it. So there we go, my more or less quick guide on how to do CAS on Enigma's Cold War server. I will be following this up with other videos looking at other types of operation you can do, such as cap, strike missions and helicopters. If you have any questions, please do leave them down below. I will try to get back to you. If you've got a specific type of video that you would like to see coming up next, do again suggest it down below. And if you found this useful, please do consider leaving a like, subscribe or sharing the video. All really does help the channel. Otherwise, I hope to catch you in the next video. Until then, remember to be kind to yourselves and everyone else. Cheers.